we should go. Are you done with your tea? Should we? Okay. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. Very glad to have Dani here today. She is a zoology conservation scientist. She earned a Bachelor of Science in Zoology, a Master of Research in Biodiversity and Conservation, and she's been working on the impact of climate change on African wild dogs during her PhD. That's, of course, what she's going to talk about today. She's also a successful writer, following some discussion on Twitter and questions from Kid. She teamed up with Nick Caruso to write the first one, Does It Fart? This book about animal flatulence, and the second one is coming up. I don't know if it's out already, which is True or Poo. Is that it? Okay, so I will add all the info in the description of video when I post it, and yeah, that's it. So feel free to share your slide, and guys, if you have questions, as usual, just put them in the chat and we'll just talk about it at the end. Okay.
So sorry about the slightly weird lighting. It's just that time of day in the UK in my front office, and that's kind of the way it is this time in the afternoon. Problems with home working. So I'm going to talk to you guys today about a topic that I've been studying since 2014, the start of my PhD. I'm now a postdoctoral researcher, but it was the topic of my PhD, and I'm continuing on kind of investigating this question, which is how does climate change impact African wild dogs? So I want to introduce you a little bit to the study species, and then the study techniques we use for working with the species, and then kind of an overview of the sorts of elements of climate change impacts I've been looking at, and kind of how that comes together, and how we kind of predict those impacts into the future. So African wild dogs are a highly social carnivore species, and they live in groups. The packs are made up of an alpha female and an alpha male. They do the breeding, and then they'll have a number of helpers, can be anywhere between 2 and 30. They're endangered. There's less than 700 packs left in the wild, and they're confined to just 7% of their historic range. So this is quite important. Often species that are impacted by climate change are quite range restricted, but the reasons that they've lost their habitat isn't climate, it's mostly land use change, fragmentation, the usual story that we have with endangered species, and also the threat from disease and human wildlife conflicts as well. So as I said, climate change often has the worst impact on species that are range restricted, and you can see on these maps here, on the left hand side is the temperature across southern Africa in 2010, the annual mean maximum, and then on the right is what it's projected to be in 2050. And you can see that it's getting a lot hotter. It's due to get a lot hotter throughout their current range. So it's kind of really important for us to predict how they will respond in situ rather than the usual methods, which are looking at where animals might shift to, because there's not really necessarily anywhere for these animals to go as it heats up. So how do we study these animals? Well, I've had the privilege of working with the long-term study site out in Kenya that's run by the Zoological Society of London, where I now work and where I did my PhD. That's the Kenya Rangelands Wild Dog and Cheetah Project. And they've been working with these animals for 17 years. So we've got 17 years of data. That's another big advantage of looking at this animal and modeling climate change impacts with the species, because we have quite a lot of data compared to most species out there. So that's a big bonus, and it's over time. So you can really tease out those temperature impacts. So at the study site, wild dogs are immobilized on 4x4. They're fitted with GPS collars. Some of those GPS collars have activity sensors, which are kind of like a Fitbit that you stick on the dogs. So that's good. We can see how much they're moving around rather than just where they're going. And in the early days of this data set, they used to fly over and they'd give the dogs VHF transmitters, and they just note sightings and numbers. So it's a bit harder back then. It's a bit easier. Now we have these GPS collars with automatic uploads on them. So as I said, it's been going for 17 years. there's over 130 dogs in the data set that have been monitored throughout their lifetimes and fitted with collars across 36 packs. So that's not just those 130 dogs, but also all the pack members, because we only collar one dog. Well, we collar 2 dogs at a time in a pack. One gets the GPS collar, and then we also fit one with a radio collar, so that if either collar fails, we can still find them and retrieve the collar and take it off them. But there's also a lot of other data that I used for these predictions. So there's a weather station on site. We also have the range-wide database, which collects sightings from all across Africa of African wild dogs. US Naval Observatory, which we use for things like getting moonlight data. The temperature projections into the future I get from a data set called Chelsea. And also I worked closely with people at 2 other sites who also run long-term projects, and that was Rosemary Groom, who runs the Save Valley project, and then Tika McNutt, who runs the project in the Okavango Delta. And those have been running for like 10 and nearly 20 years, those 2 projects. So they've also got quite a lot of data, although their approaches to collecting it aren't necessarily always uniform with ours. So the first kind of thing that to look at with a species and how it's going to be affected by temperature is often the behavior. And behavior of African wild dogs was kind of quite key when we were looking at, when we wanted to know how they were affected. They are crepuscular species, and that means that they're mostly active in the cool parts of the day. So a really good way of examining behavior is using these collars. We can look at movement, where they're going, how far they're traveling. And as I mentioned, the ones with accelerometers, we can actually quantify how much they're moving around. I call it jiggling around. It's like how much they're going up and down like this and how much they're going up and down like this. And as you can imagine, when they're hunting, they're jiggling around a lot more. So we can use that as a kind of proxy for activity levels. So here's kind of the sort of data we get from these accelerometers. So this graph here shows the crepuscular nature. You can see those 2 big peaks. Those are around dawn and dusk. And you can see they're not really moving around a lot in the middle, in the hottest part of the day. B at the bottom is the temperature throughout the day. And they're also not really doing a lot at night. So some preliminary analyses that my PhD supervisor did had kind of showed that their overall activity in a 24-hour period was lower when temperatures were hotter. So I wanted to know if they're less active when it's hotter, this was in the daytime. Can they compensate for that? How might they be able to compensate for that? And the answer could potentially be, as you can see on the graph, they're not doing a lot at night, but why can't they do a lot at night? Could they, a lot of animals when it's hot become more active at night? So I wanted to know, are wild dogs able to do this? Are they able to adapt behaviorally? So that's what I did. I just performed some fairly straightforward, well, I want to say I performed some straightforward GLMs. There was a lot of data formatting that went into it before that made it a bit less straightforward. But essentially, I just ran some correlative models about how temperature correlated with the activity levels of African wild dogs at night and during the day. And what I found is that when the daytime temperatures were hotter, African wild dogs went less far and they were less active in the daytime. But although they were a little bit more active at in the night when it was the previous day had been hotter, this was constrained by moonlight. So if it was dark, they weren't able to do that. And it was also constrained by when they were denning. So when they're denning, they've got pups in the den, they have to look after them. And it seems like that sort of seems to have some sort of constraint on how active they're able to be at night. Maybe they're not able to leave the den for fear of predation. Or it might just be that because they have so many more mouths to feed when they're raising pups, that they're just energetically too, the energetic costs are so high that they're not able to increase their energy expenditure further. But basically, it seems the answer was no, it's not really possible, at least in our study site, they don't seem to be able to compensate by switching to a nocturnal activity pattern. So that's just kind of a graph here that illustrates that. And you can see that like when it's hotter in the daytime, they are less active, but at night they're able to compensate a little bit when they're not denning, but they're not compensating at all. In fact, they're still reducing their energy at night. So that's bad, but is it bad enough to cause any problems for the population? Well, that's kind of the other part to this, is how is this behavior affecting their birth rates, their juvenile survival, their adult survival? So there was two main papers that came into that we did. So question one, do higher temperatures affect African wild dog recruitment? And the answer to that was yes, it very much does. So this was across all three study sites, in Laikipia, in Save, and in the Okavango. And at all three sites, juvenile survival was lower when temperatures during the denning period were higher. And also on top of that, our study site, where the dogs don't breed seasonally. So in Zim and Botswana, they breed at the coolest time of the year. But in Kenya, they breed all year round, on average every 11 months. But if it's hotter, it takes longer for them to have the next litter of pups. So we are seeing a demographic effect on recruitment. At higher temperatures, recruitment is lower. So conclusion, yes. And the second answer, that the question that led on from this, was obviously, how's it affecting adult survival? Is it affecting survival in adult wild dogs? And as I said, we've been monitoring these dogs throughout their lives, so we know when they die. And at the Kenya site, we even usually know what killed them. It's a pretty unpleasant process. We have to do a necropsy, but if it's an unknown cause of death, if it's not obvious, if it's not in a tree, if it's in a tree, normally it's a leopard. But we'll try and determine whether it was disease, predators, or humans that caused their death. So we had a lot of data on this, so I was able to kind of look into this. And what I found at the Kenya site was that the mortality rate was higher at higher temperatures. It was higher at lower pack sizes. It was higher on community lands as opposed to the commercial, more tourist and cattle ranching based land uses. And it was higher, unsurprisingly, when the dogs are dispersing. So that's when they leave their packs, either alone or in smaller groups. And the higher mortality rate at higher temperature at the Kenya study site appeared to be driven by human causes and by disease, which was really interesting because it showed this interaction between these human wildlife threats, but also climate change. So it's almost like a double whammy, where the human threats are causing high mortality in the dogs, and we're also causing the climate heat up, and that in turn is then increasing deaths through human causes. I call disease a human cause because they pick it up from domestic dogs. So whilst it seems like a natural cause, it's actually very linked to human activity as well. And at higher temperatures in the Botswana site, but I didn't find any evidence at all of that at the Zimbabwe site, because they're all snared. It's not, and there's no seasonal effect of that. So there wasn't really nothing had an impact on the mortality rate in Zimbabwe, because it's so random. But people aren't trying to snare the dogs; they're trying to snare for food. But the dogs, we call them snare magnets. Sometimes they just seem to get stuck in them. So I think that it's hot. You're not going to find any trends other than what causes people to put more or less snares out, and it seemed pretty consistent year round. So the kind of answer to that was, you can see here, this is a graph of those findings, and basically the dogs die off much quicker when it's hot. So the conclusions there was really, at some sites, but not in others, there's increased adult mortality, but it wasn't anywhere near on the scale on the impacts that we were seeing on recruitment. So it seemed like the main impact of climate change, and the main impact of those, unsurprisingly, of the lack of behavioural change when they were denning, seemed to be having this impact on recruitment more than mortality. So the thing with wild dogs is they're pretty big, and you can't stick them in a lab and heat them up. So what I would need to do if I want to know how climate change is going to impact them is I build a computational model. And a lot of people say to me, it's really cool, you work with wild dogs, and it is cool, and I do get to go out to the field sometimes. But actually, like anyone, I spend most of my day at a computer simulating wild dog populations and simulating heating them up. So I'm just going to run through this a bit. None of this is published yet, but it's just one's bouncing in and out reviews. So we're just kind of waiting. Yeah, so I do all my modeling in R. And I'm just going to run through the model, and there's a few equations in there, but you don't need to pay them much attention. They're just kind of illustrative in case anyone is interested. But what I do is I have all these variables in my model, which is like the period between one breeding attempt and the next, the number of pups that they give birth to, the survival of those pups to adulthood, the adult survival, how likely they are to disperse, and then I've got temperature, and some of these are dependent on temperature. So you can see here, this is kind of what those variables depend on. Everything depends on pack size. They're a really social animal, you know, there's a big feedback loop between these pack sizes and the pack dynamics and the dispersal. And when I first built my model, I ended up with infinite wild dogs, and I was like, hang on, that's not right. And it turned out that was because this dispersal probability is really key, and that's what regulates these pack sizes. So I set out to do a PhD very much on temperature impacts, but I ended up doing a couple of side papers on dispersal dynamics and group dynamics because I needed to do that to inform this model. And it's great working with a social species, but sometimes it makes your modeling very complicated. So this is just a little illustration of kind of how the model works. So it's a single sex model. There's only females in there because it becomes very, very complicated very quickly once you get the males in. And it just takes way longer to run, and you just get the same results. So we stripped it down, and you can see that you've got your juveniles, and each time step, which in this case I have a monthly time step, they get older. You've got your adult helpers, and then you've got your alpha female as well. And each time step, each dog can either, the pack can reproduce. So you can see here, they've had some pups. Dogs can disperse, or they can die. And there's a different probability, and some of them are temperature dependent. That's dependent on pack size. So, and when they disperse, they go out into this dispersal pool. They hang around for 2 months, which is the average that we observe in the field. And if a pack has died out, then a dispersal group can move in. The likelihood of the dispersal group moving in is dependent on the size of that dispersal group. So I've got 9 of these running at once, and I can change the temperature and see what happens in this population. So as I said, what I quickly found out is that it's dispersal that regulates pack size, not death, which is what we thought before we started this. And higher temperatures essentially result in smaller pack sizes. And as a result, you then get smaller litter sizes, and you also get longer interbirth intervals. So it's kind of this feedback loop where the higher temperatures are decreasing the pack size, which is then decreasing the survival. So at some point, what you just get is this population crash. Once you heat them up enough, you can induce these population crashes. And that's predominantly driven by, as I said before, we got the feeling that it was the juvenile survival that was really key. So you can kind of see, if you put in some climate scenarios here, how much hotter it's due to get in our study site in Kenya. This was just on the Kenya data. Then it's bad, basically. But then what I wanted to do was I wanted to look at how this looks across the species range. So I built 3 demographic models, and each one of the demographic models was based on a different site's data, and it was parameterized from a different site's data. And what you can do is you can basically plonk some wild dog packs in each raster square in space and run those models. And it takes a really long time, but you can get there in the end. It's very mechanistic. So unlike those kind of range shift models you might have seen, then you're running loads of different packs all concurrently, all in every single square of the map. So it's very computationally intensive. I think when I started, I had like 2,000 lines of code just for like one model run, but I did manage to cut it down. So this is the kind of thing you can get out of there. So you can put in your climate scenarios, and you can run it across the whole. This is the historic range, and what this is giving is like the percentage of the population that's remaining in those areas. And you can see as it's getting hotter, so our CP 8.5 is the worst case climate scenario, a lot of it is black, and black is bad. That means really high declines in those populations. And you can also start to pick out a few patterns of where the populations are more likely to decline, and where they're declining less. And you can take the averages across these areas. The Range-wide program has very kindly, well, not very kindly, to do their work on conserving wild dogs, has put together maps of the residence range, the recoverable range, the possible range, like where there might be wild dogs that we don't even know about. And I was able to kind of average across these, and I could see, you know, where would be worst hit, where the dogs would be more likely to persist. And this is really useful, and we're working now on kind of identifying why these areas might be more at risk, and whether we have robust conservation plans for these areas that include these climate change threats. So the implications of this, well, it's really important that we work with the Range-wide program to inform conservation policy across their range, their remaining range, and also potentially across their possible range, because there are areas we might be able to reintroduce these animals that are more climatically suitable, or will be more climatically suitable in the future. The other thing that this really did was it was like, how much data do we really need to predict this accurately, and what level of population model do you need to be able to make these predictions? And should we be making these kind of mechanistic models for more species where we do have the data? Because a lot of the time when we predict climate impact, we do it basically assuming that we don't have a lot of data. But there are species like the African wild dog out here, like lions, for example, as well, where, you know, a lot of large mammals, and then also economically important species like fish, where we have enough data that we could be building these mechanistic population models. And I think the main thing that I took away from this is just how important long-term data is. Without the 3 long-term data sets, I wouldn't have been able to parameterize the model and make these predictions. And that's just really key, and it's really important we keep long-term projects running. So I'm going to touch now a little bit on what I'm doing now as part of my postdoc. So we're deploying, I told you a little bit about the GPS collars, but we've got some collars that have what are called triaxial accelerometers, and they record 40 times every second. So you can see every footstep of these dogs. And we're using that to estimate their energy intake and expenditure. And at the moment, what we've been able to do is work with the zoo dogs. We were due to be deploying in the field, but the pandemic's put that on hold for now. But what the dogs at London Zoo enable us to do is to actually, they let us interpret the data that we'll be getting from the field. And also they like weigh themselves, which obviously dogs in the wild don't do. So we can literally see exactly how much they've eaten. So this is Selous. He's one of the dogs at London Zoo, and you can see that he's looking very smart in his collar. This was work that my master's student Tasmin oversaw, and she got all the cameras deployed, and she took this photo as well in the paddock, and worked with the keepers on this. And the keepers have trained the dogs to take the collar without any need for anesthetic whatsoever. And it's great enrichment for the dogs. They enjoy learning new things. So this is a really win-win situation. So this is just the kind of data you can get out of this. And this moves from left, where they're obviously resting, and then walking, trotting, and on towards the right-hand side, the dog is running. And you can tell from the peaks, they're just how much it's moving this way, this way, this way, and then acceleration, magnetometry, so what way they're facing, that's what those lines are. And you can tell by how big those peaks are what the dog is doing, how fast it's going. You can see its head orientation. These collars are crazy. So they were provided by the Swansea University Animal Behaviour team. And Holly English was the first master student we had working on this. She was working with some translocated dogs that were taken to another zoo. So what I just want to briefly show you guys, hopefully it'll work, is this video, which is Selous in action. So we wanted to quantify how much food he was eating, and look on the collar if we could see bites, if we could see chew and pull, and if we could then from that estimate his food intake, and then we can, with him being weighed, we can then see if we've got it right, how that correlates with his food intake. So I'll show you this now. So you can see Salus, he's the first one on with his collar, having a good chew. Sorry if anyone's squeamish, that is a horse's leg, I think. So they try and get them like pulling and tugging, which is kind of like the motion we will hopefully be seeing in the wild. Sometimes the carcass is on the floor as well, although this one happens to be a hung one, but it's good footage, so I thought I'd show you anyway. And then when you look on the collar data, you can really see this tug because it's a really forceful movement. So you can see them pulling at this carcass. So this is a really, really amazing way to get data. And hopefully that will mean that in the wild, we can just pick up the collar once it's collected the data. And what you do is you build an algorithm that recognizes this pulling movement. And you run your data through that, and it will pick out any time the dog was feeding. And then you can use the time the dog spent feeding and how many times it pulled, and how many times it, maybe did a head down movement where he's eating. You can see him doing that over on the right now. Not very effectively because he just spat it out. He's really old, so he's 11, so he's a bit of an elderly old man. But yeah, so you can see this head movement that's really characteristic, and then we can use that in the wild to say how much energy has that dog taken in. And with the temperature data that we've got, we can then use that to look at how that affects this energy intake. And that's really crucial because that will tell us why are we seeing this fall in recruitment at high temperatures. And that's where those conservation interventions come in. Is it to do with predators, or is it just to do with they're not getting enough food, and how can we address that in the field? So that's kind of really, it really drills down into this mechanism behind these climate change impacts. And once you know that, then that makes it much easier to be like, oh, maybe they need more water points, maybe it's a competition issue, maybe it's a prey issue. But without that, it's kind of hard to know what to trial. My PhD identified the problem, but we're really hoping that this postdoc work might lead the way to some solutions. So I just want to say a big thank you to all the people involved in this work, London Zoo, NERC, who funded my PhD, UCL, who are my PhD partners along with ZSL, the Rangeroy program, Swansea, who have amazing collars, and then just like all the people who are part of the team, Tasmin, my master's student, who got all these cameras out and spent hours and hours filming Salus to get this collar data. Dayden, our field manager out in Laikipia, Rosemary and Tico, who are on the other two projects, Mike and Tim down in the bottom left, who taught me all the modeling and the coding stuff. It's been a really big team effort, all of this work, and I'm really privileged to have been able to work with some amazing people. And Rosie Woodruff, who's up in the top left, was my PhD supervisor and my current PI, and she set up the Laikipia Rangelands program and has been running it for 17 years. So definitely major kudos to her. Thanks. Any questions?
Thank you. That was really nice presentation. Well, I guess everyone was expecting that because I've been doing a lot of teasing about that. Okay, so guys, if you have questions, just put them in the chat. I'll start. So you were saying that they were breeding all year long in Kenya, but not in other countries. Do you have any idea why?
Yeah, so all we've been able to say is that in Zim and in Botswana, they breed at the coolest time of year. We don't know the trigger for that. We're not saying that temperature is the trigger for that, but there's obviously some trigger in their ecology, and it can't be a coincidence, whether it's because that's the coolest time of year or because it's the most prey availability, but it does coincide with the coolest time of the year. So that's another kind of added level of worry, because it's like, as it heats up, it's not like they can move their breeding to a cooler time of year either, which is, again, you see these changes in, for example, birds here have been moving their breeding earlier in the year as it's got warmer, but wild dogs can't move to a more climatically suitable time of year because they're already breeding in the coolest time of the year. But yes, we don't know the trigger for that. It'd be really interesting to do some work with hormones, but obviously that's very contact intensive, unless you use scat. But we're hoping, as part of this current project, obviously the fieldwork's got put up, but we were hoping to do some scat analyses, so that should also allow for some kind of hormone assays and stuff as well.
Okay. And you were saying that they were getting diseases mostly from domestic dogs. Do you know which ones?
Yes. So the big ones are rabies and canine distemper. So in 2017, actually, the population I work with in Laikipia used to be historically, it was the fifth biggest population in the world. And in 2017, we lost every pack except one. And we still to this day only have one pack being monitored at that study site. Although there are more packs moving in now that we're hoping once things get moving again, we can go out and collar. But yeah, and that was a canine distemper. People moving in with their cattle, bringing in. We have a vaccination scheme for rabies, at least in the study site. But they brought their dogs with them. Dogs, and they brought canine distemper. And then once it gets in the wild dogs, they're so social that they just all get it. But yeah, rabies is another really big one. And then they also get parvo, and pretty much anything a domestic dog can get, they'll get. Yeah.
Yeah, well, just imagining that they wouldn't be in so much contact with domestic animals, but apparently they are.
Yeah, so so in Laikipia, it's a mixture of community and commercial lands, and there's a lot of sheep and goats, there's a lot of cattle herding, and all of these people will have dogs out with them, because the dogs help protect against other predators. But wild dogs kind of like domestic dogs, so they'll come and have a nosy. And yeah, so it's not great. It's not a great recipe for like bringing down disease transfer. Dayden, who was our field manager, he helps run the Laikipia rabies vaccination program, and that's been great. Like it's a great human health initiative, and it's a great wildlife health initiative. But it's much harder to fund canine distemper vaccines because it doesn't affect people, so it's often not really a priority.
Yeah, we're actually talking about that with a colleague. Like they're trying to make One Health a big priority. Like it's the key word when you like submitting a proposal. But at the end of the day, when you really have to do the work that it involves, people are not so keen. When it's like, okay, we have to vaccinate cattle for this, or dogs, they're just like, that's not really what's important.
Yeah, it's really challenging because they've got a limited amount of money. So are they going to allocate it to rabies, which is horrible, is a horrible illness that affects like so many people, or are they going to allocate it to canine distemper, which it does kill a lot of wildlife. It is a problem for lions as well, weirdly, even though it's canine distemper. But people can't get it, so it's never going to be as much of a priority. But it would be nice if we could find funds to run those vaccinations as well.
Just out of personal curiosity, have you checked if they have vector-borne diseases? Do they have ticks?
Yes, they do. They do have ticks. Yeah, it would be cool to do some ectoparasite studies with them. We always take the ectoparasites when they're immobilized, because how often do you get an immobilized wild dog? You're going to take whatever data you can get, really. But I don't think anything's been done with them. It's difficult. Well, as you know, like yeah, I think everything's probably just still stored just for in case. But then if a freezer or something gets turned off, it's like, oh.
I'm gonna get some contacts from you to retrieve those things, especially.
Yeah.
Okay, we can chat about that later.
Yeah, let us know. We've got, I'm not sure. We do work with some KWS vets as well, so sometimes they end up doing stuff. But Rosie kind of oversees all the disease stuff. It's not come, even though I've looked at it a bit, it's not come so much into my work. But yeah, she'll know what's out there and stuff.
Yeah, plus like it would be very interesting because if they are in such contact with dogs and domestic dogs, I mean that it can actually go both ways. So
yeah. Dayden would be a really good person to speak to if you're interested in the domestic dog parasites, because he, like, with the rabies vaccination scheme, obviously he's handling like 1 million domestic dogs.
Okay. We'll have a chat later. We'll need to impose that to everyone. Okay. So if you don't have any questions, I think there isn't anything in the chat yet. But Dani's contact Twitter account was on the presentation, but I will also add it in the description of her video. So if you are just shy and like waiting to ask your question later, you can, I guess, hit her up on Twitter. And yeah, thank you again, Dani. It was really lovely. I'll definitely
no worries.
share that email about the ticks. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. Bye, Dani.